4 years ago, the people of the 20th Congressional District elected Bella S. Abzug to the House of Representatives of the United States. Since there are over 500 members of Congress, membership does not necessarily lead to national recognition. But atypically, Congresswoman Abzug has achieved national recognition as a civil libertarian, as an advocate of urban priorities, women's rights, and consumer and environmental protection. Within the halls of Congress, she's recognized as a skillful practitioner of congressional politics, and by some, as a formidable adversary. Ms. Abzug, excuse me, I did it again. Ms. Abzug is a graduate of the Columbia Law School. She's a member of the House Governmental Operations Committee and a member of the House Public Works Committee. She's also the author of a book about her experiences as a freshman Congress member and is active in numerous organizations concerned with civil rights, women's rights, and has been a leader in the reform movement in the Democratic Party. But the reason Ms. Abzug is here tonight is because of her activities in the women's movement. She was active in the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, and she sponsored dozens of bills concerning women's issues. She will be the keynote speaker in tomorrow's convention of the Iowa Women's Political Caucus held here in the Memorial Union, which is appropriate because Bella was the founder of the National Women's Political Caucus. She will also be present at the fundraiser held after the speech tonight, to which anyone is invited, and we can arrange rides for anyone at the table outside who is interested in coming. Middle America sometimes has difficulty in realizing that its radicals and its general cage rattlers, you might call, are often eminently respectable persons in their own private lives. Congresswoman Abzug has 2 daughters and has the same spouse that she started with 25 years ago. 30 years ago. In fact, I think he's here tonight along with our guest. It is a privilege to welcome both the Abzugs to Ames, and in particular to welcome the one in Congress to our university lecture series.
Well, it's a great welcome. I've come a long way, and I was getting out of the airplane. They said they were closing the airport for the weekend, so you're stuck. You're stuck with me for the weekend. It's taken me a long time to come out to this middle part of the country. I know it's hard to pronounce my name, but it is Abzug. It's a little different, you know. It's not too American not to have a B and a Z together, which is, 2 consonants don't go together. Anyhow, I don't know quite how I managed to get here. It seems to me I've been traveling all day. But when I saw that sign at the Holiday Inn, it said, "Welcome, Representative Bella Abzug," I said, I must belong here. I'm delighted to be here in Iowa. We used to say Iowa when I was a kid. Do they still say it? Yeah, okay. And I'm a New Yorker, born and bred, by the way. We have a few aliens in our midst. Stand up. Okay. Actually, I'm from the Bronx, which I think is most unexpected. The reason I mention it is when I was growing up, there were some chickens next door to me. So you see, I know a little bit about the farm country. Not a lot. Anyhow, I know there's a relationship between all this corn and the price of meat. Anyhow, I feel I have a great deal to learn from the people of this state. I always feel I have a lot to learn from everybody. Well, what am I going to learn from you? I'm not too sure. Not about corn. We're all kind of specialists of that in Congress, in one way or another. But what I hope to find out from you tonight and in my weekend here is how a state with a reputation for being a quiet, conservative area has been able to send to Washington such outstanding liberal senators as Harold Hughes, I mean, well, he got religion, but in any case. I love Harold, and we need many paths to lead to solving the problems. And Dick Clark, and Congressman John Culver, and who I hope we'll see in the Senate, That's his plug for the weekend, okay. Ed Mizvinsky and Neil Smith. And I've had some very interesting times in the Congress with H.R. Gross and with Shirley and with Wiley Main, etc. It's been a very lively time. Anyhow, I hope that John has a chance of becoming your new senator. It would confirm my admiration for the wisdom and progressive outlook of the voters of Iowa, and I'm sure you'd like to have my admiration. But I have to wonder out loud why you're not running any women for Congress. I'll take that up tomorrow. Well, I was also eager to come here, as I am often eager to come to the campuses, to find out if there's any truth to the rumor that campuses are dead. You certainly don't look that way here. You look very much alive. I know you may be spruced up for the occasion. I spent a great deal of time going across the campuses ever since I've been in Congress, and a good deal before I was in Congress. Some of you may know I was an early opponent of the war in Vietnam and spent a great deal of time in the peace movement working with young people all over this country, and always achieved a great deal of inspiration from what I found on the campuses. But right now, as I said, there's a rumor that the campuses are dead, and we've been told that the new generation of college students has put away its demonstration banners and helmets, it's cut its hair and turned off from politics. I personally doubt it. I find that certainly the campuses are more quiet. Students are studying in classrooms, which I think is an acceptable thing to do. I mean, we did some of that when I went to school. But I also feel that the students are in the process of sitting in judgment on our government and on our society. Perhaps too many have already reached a verdict, and some are still making up their minds. I recently talked to a young woman who had been an exchange student in Latin America. And for the 2 years that she was there, she always felt, she said, secure and confident. In the midst of coups and dictatorships and arbitrary arrests, she said she always felt secure and confident as an American, safe in the knowledge that her government was a government of law and justice and orderly processes. Now, she says, she's back here, I feel like I'm living in a banana republic, and I don't know what's going to happen next. She says, I'm scared. You know, her reaction is very understandable. For the past 2 years, we've learned of one White House horror after another, of burglaries, of wiretapping, of enemy lists, of financial corruption, bribery by special interests, tax evasion, conspiracy, and deception. We've seen Richard Nixon gradually stripped of his pretenses to being a great statesman and brilliant, forceful leader, and revealed as an immoral, self-seeking, and craven man of such deep and unpredictable neurosis that his closest advisors were worried he might try to push the nuclear doomsday button. And we've seen Congress let itself be deprived of the opportunity, an opportunity, by the way, that it still has, to take a record vote on the Judiciary Committee's finding that Richard Nixon has committed impeachable offenses. As a result of this inexcusable lapse on the part of Congress, Mr. Nixon has been allowed to retire to San Clemency, with all the privileges and prerequisites of a deposed monarch who arrogantly refuses to admit he has committed any crimes and still nourishes hopes of returning to political power. I mean, so I gather from his son-in-law. I have no doubt that Richard Nixon is depressed and unhappy. How could he be otherwise? I'm very sorry that he's ill. I really am. Even though reports of his illness are clouded with the same self-serving and contradictory statements that marked his last years in the White House. But unhappiness is no excuse for President Ford's granting Richard Nixon such a premature and unconditional pardon. While the young man who, as an act of conscience, resisted the immoral and illegal war in Vietnam are now asked to spend 2 years in involuntary servitude as an additional punishment. Just as I regard this an unpardonable pardon, I regard this amnesty an unamnesty amnesty. Indeed, we're told that Mr. Nixon disdainfully refused to accept a pardon if it were linked in any way with amnesty for the opponents of the Vietnam War, a war that Nixon unnecessarily prolonged for more than 4 years. And Gerald Ford, who still submissively refers to Nixon as the president, was so eager to pardon him that he agreed to those terms. But Mr. Nixon's health is no excuse either for Mr. Ford seeking to lavish an additional $1 million in taxpayers' money on this man who grew wealthy in office. Nor is it any excuse for the secret negotiations that resulted in Mr. Ford's agreeing to turn over all the tapes and the records to Nixon's control without any regard to whether they were needed by Special Prosecutor Jaworski. We are told that as a former president who has fallen into disgrace, Richard Nixon deserves our compassion. As a matter of fact, they constantly say to me, "Bill, have you no compassion?" I would have thought that was pretty obvious, the answer to that. But in any case, I believe that most people do not feel, as it happens, that Mr. Nixon should go to jail. But I think that most people believe that he should be held accountable to the same laws as other Americans, and that if a grand jury so finds, he should be indicted and tried like the men who carried out his orders. I think it is time our leaders had compassion. Not for Mr. Nixon, but for the American people. I think it is we. I think it is the American people who were victimized by Watergate and deprived of a fair national election. We know, of course, that equal justice is part of the American dream rather than its reality. We know that throughout our history, poor men and women have gone to jail, even before conviction, while the rich and powerful have broken the law and gone free. We know that Spiro Agnew and Richard Kleindienst succeeded in copying a plea. We know that Lieutenant Calley was allowed to take the rap for My Lai, while the generals and politicians who sent him there and condoned atrocities in Vietnam were honored. We know in my part of the country that 41 men, guards and prisoners alike, were slaughtered at Attica Prison while Governor Nelson Rockefeller, the man who could have prevented their deaths, has since been rewarded with a nomination to the vice presidency. We know all that, but still, most Americans hoped that the Watergate revelations and Gerald Ford's promise of an open presidency could change things. We hoped. We hoped that we could have faith in our system of justice. That faith seems to be gone, and the honeymoon is over. Of course, that was one trip I never got on, because I found it a little difficult to be on a honeymoon after a shotgun marriage. A shotgun marriage between a non-elected president, foisted upon us by Richard Nixon. Imagine this. An impeachable president was allowed to choose his immediate successor. And let me tell you, there were a couple of us, and there weren't many more than a couple of us, who kept trying to explain that it didn't make sense in terms of our future democracy to have Richard Nixon, who at that time was potentially impeachable, appoint his successor, that instead we should leave the office of vice presidency open and vacant. We've lived without vice presidents before. And that in the event Richard Nixon were impeached, and I suggested both to the Senate Rules Committee and the House Judiciary Committee in testimony, that in the event we went forward first with the impeachment and Richard Nixon were impeached, as I always believed he would be, starting a long time ago when I called for his impeachment at the time of the Christmas bombing of Vietnam, even before Watergate, it seemed to me that the way to handle a problem in terms of the viability of our own great country was to see whether Nixon was impeached. Then if he was impeached, you would have a vacancy in the office of president as well as vice president, and we could have reenacted a law which we once had on the books in this country, which provided that in the case of a double vacancy, there should be an election by the people of the country. It's the people in this country. Well, it fell on deaf ears. I appeared before the Senate Rules Committee, and I gave a very erudite exposition of the history of this law that used to be on this book of this great country of ours, and why it made no sense that the 25th Amendment, which was originally enacted, was not enacted in order to fill a vacancy of a vice president. It had nothing to really do with that. It's true that it was applied legalistically properly, and I'm not suggesting it wasn't. But the real purpose of the 25th Amendment, when it was enacted by the Congress, was to take care of a situation in which a president might be temporarily disabled or disabled for an extended period of time. It was enacted after there was the Kennedy assassination, and it was intended to provide for that type of disability so that a vice president could come into play and be the president. It was never intended to cover the kind of historic situation in which a president who was to be impeached chose a vice president, and then we had no electoral mandate, but really a succession that you would have under a monarchy instead of under a democracy. Anyhow, since I'm in a university, I figured I'd give you a little bit of a history so that I did, a little thing that was academic, and if you didn't like the rest of it, well, you could pretend it was in a course and you didn't like the professor. In any case, it's interesting. It did fall on deaf ears. They wouldn't hear it. They couldn't hear it. Sometimes people who are in power structures, are not too happy to have returned to the people more than necessary. That's one of the reasons I always believed that that law that had been on the books was repealed. The idea of going to the people twice in 4 years to elect a president and vice president just sounds like a little bit too much democracy. Well, anyhow, we all know, and still most Americans hoped, that the Watergate revelations and Gerald Ford's promise of an open presidency would change things. Everybody hoped that Jerry Ford, nice fellow, you put him in there, we get rid of Nixon, everything will be hunky-dory. That was the way they thought that would work. There's an interesting thing is that Congress wouldn't listen to this proposal because it took, sort of a bold step to say we're going to hold this open, we're going to see whether the president's going to be impeached, because most of them didn't believe that he was going to be impeached. Not that they didn't think he deserved it. I mean, you, the people, all over this country, were way ahead of the Congress on this issue. Let me tell you, the public was calling for his impeachment, not even knowing that it was impeachment that was their only remedy, but they were calling for him to be removed way back while the Congress was saying, yes, they don't like Nixon, but they don't really favor impeachment. The only reason they didn't favor impeachment was because the great leaders, my colleagues, whom I love dearly, but they happen to lack certain ingredients, one of which begins with a G, called guts. Most of them. They're all good people. I'm not saying anything against them. I mean, but, you know, I think it would be better if they let themselves feel, if they let themselves think, and if they express themselves as they really felt. And many of them do feel that way. And many of them understood that the people were really fed up with Nixon. But they kept saying, well, they don't really want impeachment. The only reason the people didn't call for impeachment is because they weren't clear what their remedy really was. And if your leaders are afraid to tell you what your remedy is, then it gets a little harder. But anyhow, the people were way ahead of the Congress, you see. And the interesting thing about the thing I mentioned to you about the special election, about 1 month after we tried to convince the Senate and the House of this notion, a poll was taken, and about 55% of the American people indicated that they thought that there should have been a special election. So be it. Anyhow, as I said before, it was instead a shotgun marriage, and I think that the public was still eager to hope that equal justice would prevail over secret deals. Right now, the message is out to men and women in prison, to students on campuses, to privates in the Army, to draft resistors, to taxpayers, and to all citizens, that if you have the right contacts, laws can be scrapped, justice evaded, and the system twisted in your favor. The evil spirit of Watergate has returned, and President Ford has now committed the worst cover-up of all. As a result of his action, the Watergate trial and other investigations of the Nixon administration corruption are in jeopardy. Only an instantaneous scream. It was probably a primal scream. Anyhow, you don't know about that out here. That's a very big psychological thing that's going on other places in the country. Okay. Only an instantaneous scream of outrage from the public forced Mr. Ford to retreat from his plan to pardon the whole Watergate gang. He may still be biding his time for a more opportune moment to suppress all the Watergate investigations in the name of reconciliation. I may sound very cynical, but I think that there is a certain power that has been installed in Washington and the White House, which we are not yet rid of. And there seems to be some continuity and some continuity of that. In the last month, we've been exposed to a super public relations campaign designed to promote Mr. Ford as a lovable, wholesome character. Frankly, I don't care whether Gerald Ford toasts his own English muffins. Though it's nice that he shares the cooking with Betty. I don't care that he wears a blue bathrobe, or that he jumps up and down on a trampoline for the benefit of photographers. I do care how this pardon deal was cooked up. I do care about why Mr. Ford decided to hand back the tapes to Richard Nixon. I do care whether we have been witnesses to a constitutional succession to the presidency or to an arranged coup d'etat in which Mr. Nixon not only picked his successor, but in addition that Nelson Rockefeller, a man who was the symbol of big business and special interests, has been placed in line for the White House. I know the papers report that he only has $62 million in his own name. The other $132 million is in trust in case something goes wrong with the $62 million. I mean, it's ironic. It's terribly ironic that after the revelations of Watergate and the enormous control that special interests have had upon the direction of government, that means upon the direction of the course of your life and my life, that we should see chosen, again, handpicked, not elected by you and me, a vice president who probably represents the largest, biggest oil interests, not only in this country, but all over the world. I mean, you know, Chase Manhattan and owning all of Venezuela, and Lord knows what is all in there, and I don't know, half a dozen other Latin American countries. I mean, that's not hay, or even corn. And it's frightening. After all, he was the governor of the great state of New York. And he didn't do so good about helping us plain ordinary people there either. Well, I do care, as I know you do, whether Gerald Ford is going to deal with inflation by dumping all the sacrifices on people who work for a living, on the elderly, and on the poor, and on the young, on the people who can least carry the burden, or whether he's going to go after the banks and the monopolies like Rockefeller's corporations that are making super profits and gouging the public. And I do care whether Mr. Ford is going to continue to justify, as he did at his last press conference, the use of the CIA to help overthrow the democratically elected government of Chile and replace it with a military dictatorship that has tortured and imprisoned thousands of people. Mr. Ford defends the secret intervention of the CIA in the affairs of other countries as in our national interest. It is not in your interest that dictatorships are supported in Latin America, in Vietnam, or any place else for that matter. It's certainly not in my interest, but it is in the interest of IT&T. You know, when they talked about IT&T, you know, putting up a couple of $1 million originally in Chile, everybody laughed, you see. But it was true, wasn't it? It was not only IT&T, but it was your money. $7 million, $8 million to destabilize the country of Chile. I mean, if there's anything more cynical, more crude, more outrageous than going into a country and fooling with the destinies of the people in that country, thwarting their sovereign will. We, a country that is founded upon a commitment to the self-determination of all peoples, rudely, roughly, viciously interfering with the self-determination of the people in Chile, then taking those people and subjecting them to being killed and tortured in the prisons. This is done with your tax dollars and without the consent of the Congress of the United States that's supposed to be your representatives. We have got to do something about something like that. We have got to insist that we stop the government of secrecy, that we begin to open up the government in every form, and that this kind of policy must not go on. Do we have to be scared that we're turning into, quote, a banana republic, as my young friend who just returned from Latin America fears? Do we have to believe that things are hopeless? If we are so scared that we just give up, then I would say no. But if we are scared enough to fight back, then I think there is hope for us. I think that the democratic reflexes of the American people are working. It's something I've always bought very heavily. Something I've always believed in. Otherwise, it'd be very tough for me to get out there and say some of the things that I say when I say them. Because sometimes it's very lonely saying them, whether it's in the Congress, whether it's at a college campus, or whether it's at a debate, whether it's on a radio or TV, or whether it's to my own constituents. It's very tough sometimes to say things that nobody is prepared to say at the time, even though a lot of people may think them. Not a lot, but at least some. But I've always believed that all over this country, whether it's east or west or south or north, middle or lower or even upper, but certainly among the ordinary American, there was a fundamental reaction and a reflex for decency that would always come through in the clinches. I know it sounds extremely idealistic, and when people hear me say this, they're quite shocked because they think I'm much more hard-headed than that, but I'm not. And my 54 years has taught me, and particularly the 4 years since I've been in American politics in a public sense, I have gotten a great feeling and reaffirmation from the people in this country. I never will forget the response on the Saturday Night Massacre. I will never forget the response of millions of people when President Nixon fired Cox and attempted to shut down the Justice Department and behead the whole court system. I never will forget the millions of telegrams that came to the doors of our offices in the Congress, because it was on a holiday weekend and I came back early to prepare my impeachment petition for the next day. And I walked through these lonely halls, and in front of every door, whether the congressman came from the east or the south or the west or the north, whether he was a Democrat or a Republican, piled high in front of his doors were these telegrams, and they just came pouring in, and they were open because they didn't even have enough, there were so many coming in that they didn't have enough time to put them in envelopes. And they were all quite similar. They all called at that point for Nixon's removal. So I will never forget the response on the Saturday Night Massacre, because there was no leadership given to the people. There wasn't even an organized movement. It was just an ordinary response of the people pushed against the wall in many parts of this country economically, having a tough time getting along, suddenly seeing the connection between this type of political control with the economic conditions in this country and saying, this is our country, these institutions belong to us, and no president can act to stop the institutions of democracy from working, and we're going to protest. And they protested instantaneously and spontaneously in a way that they are right now. And this is why, in the end, democracy will survive in this country, as tough as things are right now. And we've seen this affirmation in the response to the Nixon pardon. People from all over this country see that this is not just. And in the national consensus that Nixon was no longer fit to be president. There is something missing, of course. What is missing is national leadership that can focus the determination of Americans to make our system work. And it's a great system if it can respond that way. Watergate has to be viewed as unfinished business. The investigations and the prosecutions must go on. They must. And Attorney General Saxby and Special Prosecutor Jaworski should be flooded with telegrams and letters telling them we will not stand for a second coming. A second coming in the White House. A second directed cover-up of the trials from the White House is just too much for the American people. Last week, I introduced a resolution of inquiry requiring President Ford to answer a series of pointed questions about the Nixon pardon. Under the parliamentary rules of the House, such a resolution, I'm already having a revolution with these resolutions. Such a resolution is privileged and it be called up on the floor for vote within 10 days after it's introduced. If it's passed, the President must answer within 10 days. Well, this is an interesting resolution, which I rediscovered when I first came to the Congress. I couldn't figure out how it was that I was going to get the government to respond on some facts. Anytime you wanted facts, it was very hard to get it from the executive branch of government. And I envied at that moment the English system of government, where they call the prime minister down and they throw eggs at him. Well, anyhow, they call the prime minister down and they ask questions to explain the policies of government. And it's a very, very important method of getting some answers to some very tough situations which occur, in a very quick way. So I was looking for some procedure, and I found this procedure which hadn't been used for 40 years in the Congress. It lay buried there. That's why we got to elect good people to Congress, people who want to find out, who want to open it up, who want to inquire. Anyhow, it's a way in which we can get answers to facts, and they have to answer. Now, they don't always answer. They always half answer or quarters or 1/4 or 1/10 answer, but it does challenge the executive branch of government so that they are forced to say something. And it does give us a chance to act in a committee and on the floor quickly. And we don't have to wait until the cumbersome machinery of the Congress operates, which usually takes a couple of years to get an answer to a question in an ordinary resolution. That's why you don't get any money for education. That's why you don't get any money for housing. That's why you don't get any money for the elderly. That's why you have differences of opinion on the farm policies, because it takes a long time to fight these questions out, because the policies are outmoded, the rules are outmoded, and they've got to be changed and streamlined. And that's why all of you that are sitting here in this room should be out there working to elect the right kind of people out of this state to help make those changes, both in the Senate and the House, in order to begin to make democracy meet its imperatives before we reach 1974 and 76. We're going to be 200 years old. It's very young compared to civilization, but it's very old in terms of the fact that we still don't have a democracy in this country. Anyhow, I'm glad to report to you that a House Judiciary Subcommittee, headed by Representative William Hungate, has scheduled a hearing on my resolution for this Tuesday. It was referred to that committee. I will testify, as will other members of Congress who are seeking House action on the issues of the pardon and the tapes. There are many resolutions, you'll be glad to know. The Congress is waking up, they're beginning to realize that they have the responsibility to restore this decency to government, and that we can't have two Watergates, as I said before, 2 second comings, it's too much. One was impossible, the second is just not going to be accepted. And so we're going to have people testifying, and we're going to seek House action on the issues of the pardon and the tapes. The Judiciary Committee should be encouraged to go ahead with a full inquiry into the pardon. I have proposed to Congressman Hungate that a number of witnesses be called or invited, including President Ford, Attorney General Saxby, Special Prosecutor Jaworski, General Alexander Haig, they got such titles, Mr. Nixon's lawyers and physicians, and even Mr. Nixon himself. Ooh, I've got a few subpoenas ahead of us, I realize that. But he can be subpoenaed like any other mortal human being. Anyhow, I also believe that there should be a national movement demanding that the pardon be nullified. As kooky as some of you may have been told by some of the newspapers. I'm not really. I practiced law for 27 years. I have a pretty good idea of the Constitution. I've been involved in some major constitutional battles over the years and in the course of my legal career in all parts of the country. The reason I say what I do is, despite what you may have read in the papers, I think the legality of that pardon is extremely questionable and should be tested in the courts. Now, of course, the way to do it has been made very difficult for us. The way to do it would be for either Saxby or Jaworski to let the Watergate grand jury go ahead and indict Nixon if that's what the grand jury wanted to do originally, and that appears to be, what appears to be what they were going to do originally. And they should sign that indictment. And Nixon, under those conditions, would be required to come into court to assert that he has received a pardon, you see. And therefore, the issue of whether Ford had a basis for issuing such an unprecedented pardon to a man before conviction could then be tested in the courts. You see, the Constitution says that the president may pardon a person for offenses committed against the United States. The purpose of a pardon is to remit punishment. Well, that would appear, and the cases, of course, are not clear, and even Mr. Ford indicated in his statement of pardon or proclamation that it was unprecedented. I should say it was unprecedented, all right. In any case, it would appear, from as I read the cases, that there would have had to have been at least an indictment or at least an admission of guilt. And of course, an admission of guilt is not forthcoming from Mr. Nixon. He gave us a statement of contrition. I mean, it was all in a very interesting atmosphere of religiosity. I mean, that is true. I mean, Mr. Ford called upon the Lord very excessively in the preliminary statements, I thought. This is not because in any way I intend to be irreverent, because I am not. And this is not my purpose at all, and nor is it my belief. It's just that I found that, you know, very difficult when the Constitution was being applied, and in my opinion, incorrectly, that one should call upon the Lord, and I was quite concerned about that, because it's difficult to make that appeal up there at this point. At least while we're all here together. In any case, at the very least, I think if Mr. Nixon should be forced to come into court, you see, the cases also provide that a pardon can only be asserted. In other words, the court doesn't take judicial notice of it. If there were an indictment, and if the indictment will go forward, and if Mr. Nixon doesn't come in court and claim his pardon, then they just keep going forward. The pardon has to be actually pleaded in a case. So that would be a very appropriate way to settle it for the American people. I happen to feel that he should be forced to come into court to claim that he had been pardoned, so that under these previous Supreme Court rulings, such a plea would be regarded at least as a confession of guilt, something which Mr. Nixon, as I indicated before, has disdained to do so far. I really feel that it would be a way to settle a problem in the country. There's enormous unrest all over the country as a result of this action. And I'm pleased to see that it's reached Iowa. I'm one of those people who never believes in something called Middle America. I think that the feelings of the American people are quite similar all over this country. I've always said that I think that our goals and our aims are pretty much the same. They said to me, Bella, how do you think you're going to do in Middle America? Whenever I come out to what is called Middle America, I said, I do very well. They're people and I'm people. I feel, they feel. I have compassion, they have compassion. We all want to have decent lives. Most people want to be able to get a decent job. They want to be able to get married if that's their bent. They want to not get married if that's their bent. They want to be able to raise kids if that's their bent. They want to have a decent place to live. They want to be able to have a few dollars and not have a situation like in this country where 1 out of 6 people have no assets at all. They want to be able to look to a future. They want to have an atmosphere that's pleasant. They want to be able to think that they are a great country, that they're doing great things, that they're taking care of the young and the poor and the elderly. Everybody feels that way all over the country. Every once in a while we get divided up because we get diverted from who the real enemies are. The enemy are not each other, whether we're from the east or the west or from the bottom or the middle. The enemies are not the people who are beneath us, those who are striving to come up to reach us. The enemies of the whites are not the blacks. The enemies of the men are not the women. The enemies of the poor are not always the rich, though they can sometimes be. I mean, the enemies are those who have very special economic, political, and military power, those who have been controlling our destinies without our consent and without our agreement. I think we must also seek to nullify the secret agreement under which the presidential tapes have been returned to the power of Richard Nixon. It's a very macabre thought, but if Mr. Nixon should have something happen to him tomorrow, I mean, you know, we all have that possibility. Under that agreement, the tapes could be destroyed immediately, and the Jaworski investigations would be permanently derailed. There are various moves going on in the House and the Senate to rescind the agreement, and I think these moves, too, must be supported. What have we learned from Watergate? What can we do to make this a really democratic country that works for people and not against them? We've learned that there was such an erosion of congressional power that we were on the way to an imperial presidency. Well, we must restore constitutional power to Congress. Never again must we allow a president to arbitrarily impound billions of dollars appropriated by Congress for essential social programs, as Nixon did and as President Ford has indicated he is prepared to do. Under Richard Nixon, the government was sold to the highest bidders, to the corporations, to IT&T, to the wheat dealers. But anyhow, it was only a half a dozen of them, and the rest of the fellas suffered. It's true. To the milk lobby, to the polluters, to the oil monopoly, and other special interests. Despite the departure of Richard Nixon, the control of the American economy, the power to determine wages and prices remains still in the hands of corporate monopolies. The power of the Pentagon, which has imprisoned us in a deadly and ever more expensive and threatening nuclear arms race, remains supreme. The real lesson of Watergate is that we must not just settle for a change in the palace guard. We have to demand fundamental changes in the way power is distributed in our society. We have to curb the powers of the banks and corporations that have preempted the vast wealth of the land. We have to enact basic tax reform to end favoritism for special interests. We have to cut very drastically the $90 billion military budget and use that money for programs that serve human needs. We can do that. We can. We can do that without affecting our national security. We already have more than 6 times the number of nuclear weapons that we need to blow up the world. And only madmen in the Pentagon in uniforms can discuss such a prospect with slider rule coolness. I mean, every day they're figuring out another one, another perfectly targeted vehicle. I mean, it's incredibly crazy. Believe me, it is insane. I have been watching this nuclear arms race since the early or late 50s. As a matter of fact, it's the thing that made me become very much involved with the whole issue of world peace. I couldn't believe it when I got into it as a private citizen. I couldn't believe what this whole nuclear madness was all about. How the testing was creating the strontium-90, which was affecting the milk, infecting our children, which we're first beginning to realize and see. I couldn't believe it, that we really thought that the way to conduct the diplomacy was only based upon the rattling of nuclear arms. And now that I've been in the Congress of the United States, each year when the issue comes up, I can believe it less and less. Only now we're confronted with a new project, the Counterforce Program, where we're trying to have such perfected accuracy in our missiles that it can only be utilized to change our former policy of deterrence into a first strike capability. And if we do that in this country, there is no question but that the Soviet Union will also begin to do the same thing. This madness has got to stop. We have got to begin to face the solutions of international problems through peaceful means. We have more than enough weapons to protect this country against attack. We have a nuclear superiority. Dr. Kissinger testified to that effect at great length yesterday before the Senate. There is no question about the fact that we have a superiority and an edge which give us an easy 10-year lead. The time is now. The Seoul talks are starting again to demand American initiatives, to begin saying, God, you're going to blow up this whole world. As a matter of fact, I've written a little article for the year 2000 in which, in fact, it did take place. I hope I'm wrong. But I tell you, if we don't stop this madness, it will take place. And you and the campuses have to learn to do something about it. You're interested in growth. A lot of people are agricultural students, so they're probably outside. You're probably all the liberal arts students. How many agricultural students here? How many agricultural students here? See? Well, listen, you got to tell those agricultural students that I'm working in the Congress day and night with a coalition between the farmers and the urban problems, and I really wish they would have been here tonight, because I could begin to make them understand that the people are together, not only sexually, but in terms of, and sexually, but I mean in terms of all kinds of interests. Anyhow, how can we change things? It's an enormous job. It means turning the country around and moving it in a different direction. It has to be done with people and political organization. I think it can be done, because there are more of us than them. I mean, they have all the money and all the power, but we have the numbers. And that can make a difference. We have to organize ourselves. I want to see the campuses again being in leadership of the social concerns and the political concerns of this country. I know it's hard to believe as young people in the face of this terrible unveiling of horror that we've just been through. But really, the future is yours. I have, as somebody indicated here, 2 daughters. You know, I came into the political arena at the age of 50, I think because I thought maybe I could still do something. It might not totally affect my life, though I hope it does, but it certainly can affect yours. And I think it becomes important for you to do something about it. I think that people in the campuses who are going to be going out into this life of ours and going to build it have a responsibility to join with us who are fighting to create some change. In the cities and the towns and the rural areas, as well as in the urban areas, in the ghettos and the unions, in farm groups, and certainly among women. We have a democratically controlled Congress. In comparison to Nixon and Ford, it looks good, but it's not good enough. I've seen some changes in the 4 years that I've been in Congress. Some young people, some blacks, some women are coming in, but not enough. Congress is still in the hands of a very select elitist group of people. It's male, very male. We got only 16 women in the House. We haven't got 1 woman in the Senate. It's insane. Congress is still in the hands of white, male, middle, and upper-class men. Now, as I said, I've got nothing against that, but that's not what America's all about. At least half of us are women. I'm not doing so good in that corner over there. Well, at least half of us are women. Not all of us are white. We have black and brown and yellow and tan and red. Not in the Congress, we just have a few. Not everybody is a lawyer. About 2/3 in the Congress are lawyers and bankers and business people. That's not right. You can't expect the Congress to respond if it doesn't have the great diversity that this great country has as a component in the Congress itself. It can't respond to the diverse problems or in the way that we should respond in terms of immediacy. It's a disgrace that as we approach this great 200th anniversary that we're all celebrating of the founding of our nation and 54 years after women won the vote, that we still have a very big time trying to convince people that women are a majority of the population. We need more women and minorities and young people running for office, and we need campaign spending reform so that you don't have to be a millionaire or know a millionaire to get elected. Some of that is beginning to happen. Women are organizing. You know about the National Women's Political Caucus? Hi. That's our future calling out. You know about the National Women's Political Caucus. Iowa has one of the most effective caucuses in the country. As I understand it, there are about 38 women running for the state legislature in Iowa, and 20 of them are caucus women. All over the United States this year, women are running for office, and many of them have already won nomination in very, very difficult primary fights. Well, we're not trying to take over. That is not yet. But what we are saying is that we want an equal share of political and economic power. We need more women in government so that we can bring some real compassion and an understanding of people's needs to Washington. I always believe that women will do that. People often say to me, well, what is all this? What do you think, that you're superior to men, that you're going to be so different than the men are? I said, well, I don't know about that. I mean, may or may not be superior. I'm not going to argue that question. But at least we've had so little opportunity to be corrupted by power. That we're not corrupt. And I think we'll be a long way off from that. I don't think that power will corrupt us. We will try to corrupt power. In any case, we need more women in government so that we can have this feeling in government. I think the people all over this country, as a result of what's happened, are looking to an openness, are looking to people who represent them to be human beings, not to be afraid to be human. That's one of the things a politician doesn't want to be, is human. It's got to be plastic. You stay right here, because if you go over here, it may not continue your career. If you go over here, it may not continue your career. I think you should go all over the lot, just exactly how you feel. Let people know where you are. Communicate to the best of your ability. Be credible. Be open. Be sincere. Tell people where you stand. Argue it out. And people will at least feel that there goes a human being, and I'm going to vote for that person because there's some relationship to reality. Of course, I think we need many more young people in government. For one thing, we're going to live longer. We're going to need it's going to be a long battle right now. And I think that we need stronger and more direct voices in creating a future. And we certainly need many more honest people in government. The one central lesson of Watergate that we must cling to is that despite the attempted subversion of our democracy, I think the people are still sovereign. We, the people, are sovereign. This is our country. We built it. Our forefathers built it, and even our foremothers participated in building it. The institutions belong to us. That's what this Watergate thing is all about. We fought to make certain that we maintain at least the form of control of our own institutions. And we did not permit a person to say, I ignore the constitutional and institutional structures of this country, and I place myself above it. The meaning of Watergate was a struggle for us to say what we created belongs to us, and we intend to stay with it and to try to strengthen it. We may have lost our way at times. We may have not participated enough at times. We may have yielded up some power at times, not knowing perhaps. We may have had faith, even. It was an incorrect faith because it wasn't a watchful faith in our own institutions. We have the power. And if we organize and fight for our rights and for the fulfillment of our needs, I think we can still make government and institutions work for all of the people. And so I'm here on this campus believing, after hearing your wonderful response, that the spirit of democracy is alive and well in the country and even on this campus. So don't let anybody bury it. Get out there and fight for it. Nice talking to you. I know it's late, and you have been very patient, and I talked too long, but I came a long way. Anyhow, Apparently, the procedure is, those of you who still have the energy and want to ask a few questions, I am prepared to answer them. But don't feel that you have to. Yes. Well, the problem that we've had with that is that it won't be effective unless we can also guarantee that we can do a price rollback, you see. The problem that we've had with the controls to date is they've been essentially controls on wages. And so what's happened is that the failure to control prices, profits, dividends, and interests has put the working person, who is a majority of Americans, pretty much behind. And the only way those controls can be effectively imposed would be accompanied by a rollback. I can tell you that our experience in the Congress with rollback has been very unsuccessful. We attempted that, for example, in connection with oil prices, and were beat out by the lobbies, the oil lobby, and with the enormous pressure that was put on the Senate and the House by the White House. So that's the problem. It can only be done in that context. Yeah.
Judging by our recent difficulties with vice presidents and vice presidential nominees, do you think that, one, there is any need for the office, and two, do you have any recommendations for improving the procedures?
Well, I've always felt to begin with that the vice president should be a person that's elected independently and not chosen at a convention the way they are by the president. That's number one. Life being as it is, it's very likely that a vice president can become the president, and I think that we really have to have more electoral mandate involved in it. That's one thing I am interested in. I think that vice presidents vary. I think that the vice presidents in the past have been considered not very important, but you see, as I said, we've been through some very shocking events in the course of history, in our, recent recallable history of assassinations and deaths and impeachments, and so that a vice president begins to become somebody important, and I think the direct election is one of the answers to that question.
How essential do you feel that self-made businesses in this country?
I can't hear you.
How essential do you feel that health of big businesses in this country? What role is both
That what is?
played in this country?
Well, I think, after all, this is a capitalist economy. Obviously, business and its health are important to this country. I don't want to give you the impression that I'm opposed to business. I mean, my father had a live and let live meat market on 9th Avenue in New York City. But aside from that, business in this country is not healthy at this point. I mean, our economy is out of whack. Sure, the very, very enormous corporations are still, bringing in enormous profits, and certain enormous agri-farm. Look who's here. It's a dog, not a wolf, right? The enormous large monopolies in many areas, whether it's oil or power and so on, of course, I think have to be extremely questioned, and I think we have to find the way to fight their monopoly power. But obviously, our system and our economy is based upon a healthy business structure. I think that business is suffering from an incorrect economic program, as well as the fact that we see the working people suffer who are being thrown out of work. So you can't, under this system, thrive unless you have a healthy business economy. It's only if you change the system that that can be changed. Yeah. Is that the rights? But did you? Well, I must say that we're a pretty long way off from that. You know that in many areas in the country, I don't know what the situation is in Iowa, but there are city councils that have sought to pass civil rights bills for including provisions which provide for no discrimination by reason of sexual orientation. In New York